Okay, I think we'll get started. So thank you for hanging around for the last session. We'll make it interesting, hopefully entertaining, and then we're off to drinks. So I'll do a quick round of introductions just as housekeeping. Let my panelists and colleagues also introduce themselves. We'll probably do 3 or 4 questions, and then open up to the audience if you have any questions. If not, we'll continue discussing other things. So today we're going to be discussing the regulatory environment in the space and opportunities that might exist for us to align regulatory across different jurisdictions. And so hopefully we get to a point, and I think it kind of fits well with what was discussed this morning actually on the investment panel that Phil Vanek led around how do we get to a point maybe where Europe is seen as a regulatory block for approvals, US, and how do they recognize each other on more of a partnership basis. So just to kick it off, I'm Matt Hewitt. I'm the CTO for Cell and Gene and Biologics at Charles River Laboratories. Charles River primarily known in our legacy business and preclinical CRO and animal work. About 3 years ago, we did get into CDMO across plasmid, vector, and cell. So we do have various sites in the UK and North America for that. We also have leverage our traditional preclinical CRO business to offer services across the spectrum in terms of advanced therapeutic development. So hand it off to Jean-Philippe for introduction.
Good evening, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Jean-Philippe Combal. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Vivet Therapeutics. So we're Paris-based and Pamplona-based in Spain, a gene therapy company. So we're a clinical stage company focusing on liver metabolic disorders. And we're running clinical studies in Europe and US, and I've been talked to different kind of payers, talking about the durability, sustainability, and so that'd be interesting to see the regulatory and payers conversation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Lehmicke. I'm the Senior Vice President of Science and Industry Affairs at the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. I want to thank all of you for being here at this meeting and apologize for standing between you and drinks, but I will try to make this time worthwhile for you. In my capacity at ARM, among other things, I work on behalf of our members advocating for regulatory policy that makes sense for the field.
Good evening, afternoon, whatever it is. Devyn Smith, CEO at Arbor Biotechnologies, also chairman of ARM. Arbor Bio is a next-generation gene editing company. We utilize a variety of editing technologies to really tackle different genetic diseases that are either orphaned in the liver or are in the CNS. And we are headed towards our first clinical filing towards later this year. Thanks for having us.
Hello again, I'm Richard Wilson, Senior Vice President, Primary Focus Lead for Genetic Regulation at Astellas. I'm accountable for our AAV portfolio of programs targeting neuromuscular disease, CNS diseases, some cardiac, and also some ophthalmology areas. We're an end-to-end gene therapy unit from research through development, commercial with our own manufacturing team, which sits inside a larger multinational Japanese headquartered pharmaceutical company.
Appreciate it. And thank you, Richard. You didn't get lost. You're supposed to be up here twice. Appreciate you being up here twice.
Why not?
So we're going to start off real quick about some of the ongoing efforts in the space to potentially try to align some of the regulatory strategies between jurisdictions. And so first we'll ask Mike to weigh in, but then of course the other panelists, if you would like to add, please feel free to do so. Let's keep this conversational. So Mike, you are familiar, I think, at least with several initiatives in the space to try to align some of the regulatory, so maybe we could start there.
Yeah, maybe I'll talk about one specifically, which is the Cogent pilot. Not actually active yet, but we're aware that this is in the wings to start hopefully soon, based on an announcement that Peter Marks made at our State of the Industry briefing this past January in San Francisco. So the Cooperative Gene Therapy Global Pilot, it's not a perfect acronym, but the idea is that a sponsor can apply for parallel regulatory review in multiple regions, specifically including the standing members of ICH. And this would be done under strict confidentiality. And the idea is, and again, for gene therapies for rare disease, we don't know what the criteria are yet, but sponsors could apply. And the idea is that it would hopefully speed up the efficiency and the speed of the regulatory review. And there's some reason to believe that this can work, and that this is a good idea because the project is actually based on another standing program at FDA called Orbis, which is run by the Oncology Center of Excellence. I think Peter Marks has a lot of respect for that group. And the history on that, after several years, I think going back to about 2017, is there have now been something like 78 products that have been approved in oncology products, mostly monoclonal antibodies, approved through that program in multiple regions.
Appreciate it. Nothing else to add? All right. Maybe I'll skip down. As we're talking about, Cogent and the others, on the prep call, we had a fairly interesting discussion about when that should potentially be applied. And so I'll open up to anybody who wants to chime in first, but we actually had a pretty good discussion about, is Cogent something we would want to apply to all gene therapies as an example? Or we would potentially want to have this done initially for rare and ultra-rare indications, and then maybe move out from there and think about some of the more common indications, and whether it's Heme or any applications of PCSK9 therapy. So open up the floor to whoever wants to start.
I'll take a crack at it, but I think it'd be good to start somewhere. I think that would be a good starting place anywhere, I think would be a good start. It's likely that it would probably start in the orphan space, but that tends to be where most of these therapies tend to be developing today. I think it would probably be a nicer place to start. You've got smaller patient populations, hopefully a little more control over what's going on, and understanding that can be between different jurisdictions. I think if you move towards larger patient populations, it probably becomes a lot more complicated to try and align. And so starting small, figuring out how to do it, and then moving bigger would seem to make sense to me.
I'll piggyback on Devyn's point as well, as I think, there's a risk that if you swing large here, we try and boil the ocean, there's a whole lot of complexity that can come along with that. And I think what I find really powerful about starting in the rare and ultra-rare areas is, the unmet need is unambiguous. The urgency to act, the urgency to kind of build coalitions and do something for the greater good is pretty clear. For the avoidance of doubt, I think gene cell therapies will find a home in all sorts of indications over time. Starting early now in larger indications sets up a whole other series of potential complexity around, are you trying to displace a standard of care? Do you have to then go and prove that there's something different about your therapy that places it X% above what, is out there already? And those are all reasonable questions, but I think that in some ways the rare and ultra-rare question is in some ways a purer question to ask, because you don't have it clouded by all of these other issues that come with more, crowded pharmaceutical space.
Just maybe one comment is, when you have this kind of multiple regulatory conversations, it's very useful to bring real-world data from the different regions and eventually confront some potential discrepancies you may observe. But you're going to have to educate the agencies more than you believe sometimes, even if division of extensive experience. But having this real-world data be more or less consistent will actually help you to guide the kind of alignment you need to look at. So I think it's important when you start the conversation is to have a sufficient clinical standard of care or natural history or real-world data that you have been able to assemble, because sometimes you have slight different discrepancies which can actually make some endpoints sensitive.
Appreciate that. So when you start thinking about running a clinical trial in this space, whether it's rare, ultra-rare, or otherwise, what are the different considerations and what affects decisions about where to run these clinical trials if you're doing gene editing versus gene transduction via viral vector. So maybe, Devyn, I'll start with you and get the input there.
If we look at the, there have been just a few gene editing trials that are either underway or have been done. Only 2 years ago, you basically had 2 ongoing studies ex-US, both of which started in sort of the UK and Australia. And there were applications to perform gene editing in the US. And if you're familiar with the journey that Devyn and Talia went through last year, they both got there eventually. I think they had to file with patient data from their other jurisdictions. And I think there was a little bit of frustration in the editing space that you shouldn't have to bring clinical data to the FDA to start a clinical study. And I think the FDA has been going through a lot of transition trying to understand the space. It's a new space, but it seems to be getting better. You had the approval of the iCure editing study recently, which was a good sign. So I think that most editing companies, though, are starting in Europe or in Australia and New Zealand and then moving to the US. And I think that's the case today. Hopefully that will shift over time, because I think the US should be taking a leading position here, or at least a co-lead position with the Europe and Australia. But that I think is evolving still. So for us, we are starting in European territories first, because you have a clear expectation and path as you have conversations with the European regulators what they want. I think the U.S. is getting there, and it will get there. But so that's sort of from an A perspective, as opposed to a gene therapy perspective where there's a lot of comfort with it in the U.S. Now, when you come at a gene editing within a viral transduction, then you're also sort of in another more complicated space, which I think will come eventually too.
I can think of another area as well where this kind of follows up, and that's in the context of degenerative conditions where you want to try and treat earlier in the treatment life cycle. I think we can all think of plenty of diseases where there's this sense that we have to follow a particular algorithm, start in adults, maybe in patient population that is, for air quotes, almost too far gone, so that you can show this thing is safe, and then you get down closer and closer to patients who actually might have this most significant benefit. And I think we've seen a few cases where that kind of approach from, say, FDA has forced sponsors to go elsewhere. I think the MHRA, for instance, has been very receptive to the idea of prioritizing, say, pediatric studies where there's the highest unmet need in pediatric patients. I feel it's also important, however, though, to acknowledge there are some green shoots, there's some signs of change. Peter Marks and Nicole Verdun, I think, are really trying to lead the charge from the front. And we are starting to see a few companies, I think iCure come to mind, Neurogene last year, were both able to start gene therapy studies in the pediatric patient population first. And I know within Astellas, this is something we talk about a lot. I think we're not quite at the level yet where we feel it's predictable as much as we would like. I think we've all seen that there's a certain variability in the response depending on who receives your file and what their sense of precedent is. But I think trying to think as much about how do we redesign that process so we can get as quickly as possible into patients who are going to show the biggest benefit can only help.
Just maybe to reinforce what was said by Richard is we've seen over the last 5 years significant change on this dynamic, because they used to say, you have to use very safety ratios, subtherapeutic doses, and you have to test in older population who will not get any benefits, but you have to evaluate the safety. Now we jump over 5 years from you should be as close as possible to your eventually subtherapeutic, but close to the therapeutic dose, and you should take the optimal population. It's a big shift over 5 years we have observed in different indications, and that's giving the ideas that the benefit risk is better balanced. They were more on the risk side, and they tend to go on the benefit side, balancing the benefit risk. So it's a significant positive dynamic for me.
Yeah, and I mean, this is kind of off script, so don't get too angry with me, but I was actually having a conversation earlier today about precedent in regulatory, and that a lot of times it may seem like, even if it's not true, that precedent is set by the first company or program in the space to move through the process. And just wondering if I can get some thoughts on that, because if we look at where we were 2 years ago, we are in a very different place than we are today. And we're very likely to be in a very different place 2 years from now than we are today. So how do you see the precedent, and what do you think is a good, let's say, compromise between doing things in a way that stays in the comfort zone of the regulators, or maybe pushes them a little bit out of it, but still keeps us moving in the right path to bringing these therapies to patients, making them commercially viable, while also dealing with some of the cost, considerations that we have. So whoever wants to start.
I'll maybe take a bit of a swing. I'll accept the kind of ninja off-script question here and pivot a little as well, as I think that I think we have a tendency where we just look at the regulators. It's all on one side here. It's all about, is the FDA going to say yes, no, or going to go back to a dogmatic way of working? Not to say that isn't a thing. I think candidly, there's also a question to ask of sponsors. Being in one of the larger organizations, I know that there's several of us who are kind of building out new ways of working inside existing companies. And when you think about the role of regulatory affairs in traditional companies, it was kind of this FDA whisperer, EMA whisperer thing, where your job was to craft the memo in this very strange, oldie-worldy English, whatever it would be. You'd send it off to the agency, you'd get the tablets of stone back, and your job was to interpret what that meant for your colleagues, so they knew when to go and do. And that's a very different mindset to where I think, those of us who are in kind of these newer areas, a lot of people in newer companies, and frankly where Peter Marks, I think, is expecting us to have a dialogue here. I think we need to we need to approach interactions as a conversation, that, when you don't hear necessarily the first thing that comes back from a regulator is exactly what you hope they might say. You understand this is going to be an engagement that's going to go several rounds. You'll have to listen to regulators. Hopefully the regulators will listen to you. This isn't just a one-way transfer of information from one brain to another brain. This is something we're going to have to create together. And I think, yes, there's a lot on EMA, FDA, PMD, you name the regulator, but there's also some of that comes back to sponsors too.
That really resonates with me. I spent many years working in large pharma and being told by regulatory that I couldn't speak with FDA and certainly not have a logical, straightforward conversation. That would be a detriment to any program. And I agree, it is two-way. It's a learning process, right? And I think sometimes when somebody's first through, maybe it sets precedent, but they could be just struggling with being able to, as a single company or a small number, sort of teach the FDA what they need to know. And the example you gave is a great one. I actually asked someone at FDA about that who was not involved with those reviews. It wasn't Peter Marks, but someone who's been there for a while. I said, what do you think about the fact that these companies went OUS for their phase 1 studies because they felt the bar was just too high? And the answer was very interesting. It was, well, but our bar really isn't that high for phase 1, so they must have done that because that's where the patients were. And I just said, okay, I don't think that's really really the case. But so it just kind of goes to show you that there are green shoots. I think with the reorganization of OTP and bringing in new resources, things are getting better, but it's very much a work in process. And if we want to work that, we're going to have to do it together as an industry, in a collaborative way with FDA.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think one of the best things that's happening in the, OTP now is you have new leadership, and there's been such a turnover of staff that there's a whole new staff, which is a little painful now. But as that staff comes up to speed, they're learning a culture and an approach that's actually, been stamped by Peter Marks and Nicole Verdun that is very different. And so I think I'm very encouraged that going forward, things are going to get better and better, and there will be much more of a dialogue. I mean, if you think about, like Richard said, the old days, you would never have seen someone like Peter Marks come speak at all these conferences to companies, right? That would never have happened. And he is consistently at these meetings talking and being very open, and sometimes I'm shocked that he'll take any question. He doesn't always answer it, but it's pretty shocking he'll take some of the questions he does. It's really, I think, a real breath of fresh air, and I think it will get better, and it will continue to get better to where I think it's much more of a partnership. Because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing, which is safe medicines that are effective in patients, and hopefully that's what we get to.
Okay. So there's several things. Actually, you know what? Does anybody from the audience have any questions? All right, Ben, you were very quick.
Hi, Ben DeWeese, Kyverna Therapeutics. We're patting the FDA on the back for being so great over the last 2 years, and I agree. I've had really good interactions with those people. How do we make those changes here in Europe? How do we interact with the regulators in a more personable way? How do we help them feel more comfortable working in a more collaborative environment, given that there are so many different cultural challenges and bureaucratic challenges with working with all the different member states? Any ideas from you guys on like for a small sponsor or from Astellas, something like that, to work with the regulators here?
I'd better take that. Unless, Jean-Philippe, would you like to
I
kick on?
can just give some kind of experience. There's always a balance between going to EMA first and get this scientific advice, eventually get a follow-up on scientific advice, but then you have to go to national agency, or you do the other way around. It depends on the complexity and expertise of the country. So generally, you're more likely to go for a strategic standpoint at the EMA, but then if you ask a meeting to national, they will refuse because they say, no, you already have the European statement. So sometimes you may have to go and select, where am I going to conduct my clinical trials? And say, I'm going to take, well, let's say we go to MHRA, and then we go to, is Germany a challenge, or do we go to Spain, which seems to open more some gene therapy clinical trials and very active. Should I go to France, where I know it's going to be painful, it's going to be difficult? I'm French, so I can command this. But I think we've been going through different health authorities and assembling all of the opinions, and then you can try to go up if necessary. But it takes time. You can run them in parallel if you want. It's going to take probably 6 months on the whole. But if you do it earlier compared to your CTA content or your CETIS content now, it could be a valuable experience, and you may close some countries or open the right countries.
I think that was well said. I mean, I don't know if any of my regulatory colleagues might watch a recording of this later on and fall off their chair about what I'm going to say. But, from my perspective, we've not had particularly high hurdles from European regulators. And that may be partly because typically, FDA is always one of the first on the list, and they've kind of beaten you into shape by the time you go to have a discussion in Europe, or at least what the concerns are. I think conversely, it would be wrong to say we all think that the FDA is firing perfectly on all cylinders right now. There's a lot of things we could talk about if we were in confidentiality, where say like, boy, we've had some real issues. I think from our perspective anyway, it's just about understanding the channels that are available, making good use of scientific advice, getting started early. So, before you're ready to file that CTA or whatever, you've kind of got that heads up of where a particular country's, philosophy is going to lie. I know this is a regulatory panel, but I lose a lot more sleep over payers in Europe than I do.
We'll get there.
Yeah, I would agree that just to 5 years ago, we went to the different European regulators for pre-CTA meetings. very difficult. Doing that now is actually, it's like night and day. And I don't know if part of the influence is that the MHRA has really been taking such a leadership approach on these novel therapies that it's kind of been pulling the rest of, even though they're not technically part of Europe, they have certainly influenced because there's a vast difference, I think, at having those initial conversations, whereas before, I think it was inverted. The FDA would usually, would be the one you go to first, so you go to Europe. But I think many people are starting in Europe and then going to the FDA because of just all the staffing issues, et cetera, there. And it's working, I think. But I agree with Richard. That's the easy part, I think, within Europe, in the sense of what comes next is where it gets more challenging.
Right. Speaking of which, the one example that we typically talk about with that is Lehmicke, right? Because it was approved here first. It's been treating patients, been getting reimbursed, and more recently has been approved in the US and has a significant impact on patients' lives and everything else. So, but the first thing you read when you Google Lehmicke is most expensive treatment in the world. So I guess the question that we were somewhat circling around before was, are we beginning to see that, the regulators in multiple jurisdictions are starting to see the value of these therapies, and while the goal is to, as quickly as possible bring the cost down, they still see the benefit to reimburse.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, actually, because I think it's reimbursed in something like 11 different countries in Europe. It is unfortunate, I feel like if you want to be misinformed on a topic, Google it and pick the first thing the first thing that comes up, and that is what comes up the price. And I'll echo what Tim Hunt said in his opening remarks. I frequently echo Tim because he's my boss, but he's also right in this case. It's kind of an emotional reaction. It's a normal reaction, but it's an emotional one. Personally, I think the emotional reaction I had is that headline should have said, the drug is approved, which will save children's lives, right? And I don't know how you put a value on that. But I think, ICER's done some work in that area, which we think is good work. And I think, the challenge is that, especially in Europe, but also in the US, that not every gene therapy is going to have that kind of dramatic, clear effect. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's some interesting things going on in the US with a pilot that CMMI is doing for negotiating on value-based payment for sickle cell disease. But yeah, we're really worried about Europe. And I can't wade too much into the market access issues because it's not my area, but we're worried about the JCA and what is looking like a strong bias against single-arm trials. The Lehmicke was approved based on single-arm trials, 2 single-arm trials comparing to historical data. So that's an area of a very heavy advocacy focus for us, and will be in the near and midterm future.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and one that someone once said as well that we're all concerned about price, but the far harder conversation is to tell a family, I'm sorry, I can't treat your family member because it's just too expensive. So the first thing I always can do is we need a therapy first. Then, we have a pretty good habit of innovating our way out of these problems, which I think we will do. But, coming back to the point you've made around the single-arm trials, and certainly Tim was talking about that, Jean-Philippe, you being here, control groups in these degenerative diseases, how are we going to potentially, are there other avenues that we can use to convince the regulators here in the EU that we can use natural history, or you were talking about real world, maybe expand on that?
It's always the complexity of what are the robustness of the data we are providing to agencies. For example, we've been looking at real-world data from different databases in French Social Security. We've been looking at the US and Japan, and we see some issues because we all want to get some very nice natural history, which could be extracted from real world or databases coming from vendors. We see a lot of issues in coding, wrong diagnosis, not complete. So if we want to extract more and more natural history data from real world data, we need to start from the quality of the information we get in the database. So that's something very important. Because, for example, in the US, to get reimbursement, you have to get a code on ICD-10. And this code on ICD-10 is never removed if it's a wrong diagnosis. So you end up by having patient having the disease, but no treatment. Or eventually having the treatment, the disease, but they stop. So what do? You remove so many patients that your database is so weak that you don't know what the quality is. So we definitely need to think and work with the patient association. The main value patient association can drive is a natural history, is to assemble a lot of patients they have and make sure they want to commit to share their file, be part of a natural history data, retrospective, prospective, whatever we want, sectional, but that's something important to go through. And the better quality we have, then we can decide how can we compare to natural history. Can we extend this patient and compare to baseline? And also, can we do a standard of care comparison if there is one, whatever it is? The last point I will raise is the clear notion of how we're going to build if somebody's asking for double-blind placebo. Sometimes it's totally impossible in gene therapy. Double-blind, double-dummy. I mean, this is just logistically, there's already a burden on the patient, a burden on clinical trial. You're going to get lots of issues in operational, so it's just totally impossible. So for me, the quality of the data we are going to assemble from even when we start the research program is something we need to invest. It will be, we were talking about collaboration and sharing, it will be something we can share. If our program fails, we can share with the patients, we can share. And that's why the patient should be committed, because we can share with other companies. And it's something valuable for the patient community and for the science. But I know it's always a balance and who owns what in terms of IP and priorities. But I mean, at the end of the day, we're serving patients. So it's a path we should decide.
And this is, in the extreme case, you could have something that, completely is curative or, significant benefit to some very, very sick patients in clinical studies, and it won't be approved. I mean, that's kind of the extreme case. And I think, there's a couple different outcomes I see occurring here. One is that there's some sort of carve out or accommodation to help, these types of therapies, because you should, in most, large diseases like schizophrenia or something, you need placebo control. But I think that's, that you have some kind of carve out. The other example is that, there's got to be some sort of education of what the impact of this is in this space, because otherwise you're not going to be able to enroll clinical studies here, because, you have you're a parent of a child, or, you're very ill with something and you have a 50-50 chance of getting treated versus going in and getting some invasive treatment to deliver saline. I mean, it's not it just doesn't make sense. And, and arguably probably not completely ethical in some cases. So I think it's just a matter of, trying to throw a blanket approach to all clinical trials is clearly not a great approach without understanding there's nuances and impacts on different things, which I think that is, they understand and we educate as ARM and as an industry. It will make sense, and I think there'll be some accommodation somehow, right? It has to be, because it just is, it's illogical as if you look at it sort of as a uniform approach.
I fully agree, and one of the points is the window of opportunity for the patients. Sometimes you're looking at neurodegenerative or whatever disease, you may have a status of the patient like fibrosis, degeneration, and so on, is losing the window of opportunity. It could be a 6-month window, which can be very short. So what do you do with the patient's family pushing you to get this treatment as part of clinical trials, and you say, sorry, it's going to take another 6 months to get approval?
It's such an interesting topic to me. I feel as though there's so many interconnected things here. It's hard to unpack it all. That on the one hand, in Europe especially, you'd think you have the ideal location where having a single payer who owns a patient's healthcare from cradle to grave is the ideal place to make an argument for the benefits of a one-time treatment. And yet, Europe's become one of the hardest places to make that case. And I think the interesting question here is what's behind that. I think there's been some fantastic discussions at the conference over the last 2 days. I especially like Paolo's panel this morning. Kudos to the Minister of Health who came in to talk on behalf of Italy, for kind of entering the lion's den a little here. But, it was interesting listening to that conversation, thinking that underneath all of this, it feels like there's fear on both sides, on literally all sides. The patient fear and the family's fear is obvious. The developer's fear is like, well, is this going to be the end of the road? Do we shut down our company? Do we actually lose this technology from the global armamentarium of treatment options? And from the payer side is like, am I going to open the floodgates? And they think like, well, today it's like 20 patients. Tomorrow it's going to be 20,000. And I've just told you guys I'll pay 2 million euros. And I think it feels to me we've got to find ways to bridge that gap. We got to try and break down that fear so that we can really kind of resolve the stalemate. I've got to believe at some point everyone actually wants to do the right thing. It's just working out how to have that conversation that takes the fear out of it and that helps to maybe better define what it is we need to achieve.
Well, that leads well into the next question, which is around that topic. Do we do a good job of explaining to the regulators about the potential medical cost avoidance that we may have with some of these treatments? And is Europe potentially, where many times there is a lot of centralized healthcare systems, is it the best place to potentially start to quantify some of those savings? Because the therapies may be expensive, but the ongoing medical care, in addition to alternative therapeutics that are more maintenance therapeutics rather than potentially curative, we sometimes don't take all of the costs into consideration.
I think it is a unique situation now because, we've never done this before. So the entire system in the US and Europe and everywhere else is built around chronic treatments or, different approaches. And so they do annual budget cycling. They know what they're going to spend on, Lipitor, pick your drug. And it's, it's just sort of, you had your discussions, you push back on price, and no one is completely happy, but it worked. And now suddenly the system's completely been disrupted by these one and done therapeutics that the system is completely not built for it. And so we're trying to shove something into a system that's not made for it. We have these amazing therapies. And in theory, you're right, Europe would be the perfect place because you have a single payer for the life of the patient. But they're operating on an annual budget cycle, and that's what they look at. And they, in many ways, I can get it. It's like, well, so I save money 20 years. Over the next 20 years, I can't make my budget today, which means, we have a big problem. So I think the entire system is a mess right now, both in the US and in Europe. And I think these therapies it's going to evolve. I think your point was good. When there's innovation there will be innovation on the payer side. And what that looks like, I don't know. It just seems like there should be approaches and innovation that occurs. And I think it will, because the system will have to change because parents and patients will demand it as these new therapies come through. And so, we will have to evolve how we think about pricing, and the payers will have to evolve. And, I think the current sort of stalemate and standoff is just not going to hold. I don't think.
It's a great point, and it's really a very similar problem in the U.S. So the system is not built to reimburse for long-term value. And even when you have the data to demonstrate that it's true that these therapies have long-term value, take hemophilia can cost $20 to $25 million in treatment for a patient over the course of their lifetime, compared to a one-time gene therapy treatment. There's still the budgetary problem, right? And for state level, in particular, if you're talking about like Medicare and Medicaid. So they're like, well, how am I going to pay for it in my budget? So it's a problem, and I agree with everything you said. We gotta learn to think about it differently.
Okay. We have about 5 minutes left. I'll open it up for questions to the audience if there are any. Okay. We'll continue on. So one thing we were also discussing here, Jean-Philippe, was the difference in the U.S. versus the EU and accelerated versus conditional approval, and how that may also affect how you're approaching various indications, because one is granted and then you keep it as long as you continue to show the benefit, where the other is a little bit less stable. So maybe you can comment on that and what you've seen in this space.
I've been reading a paper on this topic to look at conditional, which I feel as a, I would say, half-empty glass, and accelerated approval like a half-full glass, basically. And this paper was saying that it was done by German and Swiss Cancer Institute. 83% of the accelerated approval in the US are in oncology, and Europe's almost the same. Out of these programs, 36 to 38% have a high therapeutic value. But of the one accelerated approval in the US, only 22% have conditional approval in Europe. So I think the issue we're facing with payer is that I think there's a recent paper showing on oncology, there's actually almost 50 to 60% of the oncology accelerated approval program do not improve mortality or overall survival. So they have, I would say, some elements to argue about the pricing eventually. That's where we need to do a lot of commitment. But the main issue I see today for, conditional approval in Europe is that they will actually discount very severely the uncertainty of any gene therapy. But they will never reduce this discount when we gain certainty on the benefits. So it's an unbalanced system where we're facing some, I'm going to charge you a significant discount because you have lots of uncertainty. You cannot show me the data over 10 years, you're claiming, but they don't say, or they claim eventually they will do it, but they never do it to show a price increase over certainty of information. And that's damaging the innovation system, because we were talking about the global budget impact. Maybe we could have some balance between limiting the budget impact over some years, but also we get some reward over the long term and we get some significant benefits. But this notion of unforeseen and foreseen uncertainty is totally unbalanced today, not in favor of any kind of innovation investment in Europe. And for me, it's not. I'm not sure the GCA will take the right way. We'll see with the HTA. I'm a bit provocative. I apologize for that.
I think it's a really good point. And even, there's been a lot of positivity around the use of accelerated approval in the US, right? Like Peter Marks is now sending out drumbeats saying, expect this for gene therapies. We've seen other, like Sarepta was a beneficiary that comes to mind. And I know in the teams I've been a part of, there's always been this watch out of, if you have an accelerated approval and you go to a payer in the US with a biomarker outcome, you might not get the response you're looking for. And I think, to me, it's going to be very dependent upon the specific therapy and the specific unmet need. And I think, again, it means we have to be very thoughtful about what therapy are we designing and asking a regulator and a payer to address versus the unmet need. And I think that's something we haven't always been as good at doing, and we need to get a little more savvy about. At the same time, this also comes back to the other topic of when you're filing your CTA and your IND, what endpoints are you putting in your clinical trials? Because I think a lot of the pain we've experienced as a sector is you show up at the door saying, here's our finished product, and the regulator says, yeah, okay, I'm good with that, and the payer says, this is not at all what I had in mind. And by that point, you're 5 years too late at least. And so trying to think about how do we proactively get ahead of that by thinking of novel clinical trial designs, maybe novel endpoints, that we can get more alignment with payers and with regulators, where we're not going to be forced to say, yep, this is great, please generate 10 years of data and come back and then we can talk about your launch. because I think that's the other part that's missing yet, is the sense that we need to get the credibility these therapies really will deliver over the long haul. And I hope that we'll get there by data being gathered on multiple products today, but it's not guaranteed.
And, you made me think of something too. A related issue is how do you get that data over 10 or 15 years? And how do you get it without burdening the patient excessively? Making them come back in however many times it is for perhaps like an invasive procedure. And I'm thinking about a comment you made in that chair maybe about an hour ago about thinking about other ways that we can collectively collect the data from patients, things like wearables and things that are related to the patient's quality of life on a day-to-day basis that you can measure in some way, maybe continuously, as they're just going about their normal routine, hopefully.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I was reminded of, the challenge colleagues at BioMarin experienced, I think, when we looked at the label of Roctavian and we looked at the monitoring requirements for gene therapy. I think they looked as intense or maybe even more so than if you're in a clinical program. And, at some point that has a real impact, right? So we've got to find less invasive and less intrusive ways of gathering this data without a doubt.
All right. Well, thank you all, and thank you all for hanging around to listen to us. Please feel free to come and chat with the panelists afterwards, and we'll see you at drinks. Thank you.